Before moving on to the next lesson, try this warm-up question. What types of graphs are these? And what quantities are being represented graphically? So pause the video, see what you come up with, and then you can check back in. So this is an example of a bar graph. Hopefully you got that one, and you didn't say histogram. This is a line graph. Now you might have said scatter plot, but a line graph has the line connecting the dots. So this is technically a line graph. Now what quantities are being represented graphically? Well, let's take a look here. We have education, arts and sciences, business. This is college majors and the frequency of people who took these majors. So we would say the quantities represented are college programs. For this one, we have sales in millions of automobiles, and this looks like years along the bottom. So we would say this is probably representing car sales. So this next lesson in our data management topic is on 1 and 2 variable data. So a variable is just a piece of information that you're measuring. We're going to talk about 1 or 2 of those, and you have to distinguish between situations that can be represented by 1 variable or 2 variable statistics. So we'll talk about what that means and how to do it. First, we've got to get through some terminology here. So this would be a good thing to write down if you're going to write down some stuff so that you know what the words mean when they're used. So the first thing is a variable. Variable is an attribute or a quantity that we are interested in measuring. So for example, if I'm interested in knowing people's heights, the variable that I'm measuring is height. Or you can measure age. Age would be a variable. Anything that you're measuring or keeping track of, that's your variable. And you can have 1 variable statistics or 2 variable statistics. For 1 variable statistics, it's a measure of 1 attribute for each item in the sample. So for example, if I have a sample of 10 people and I'm just measuring the height of each person, that's 1 variable statistics. I'm measuring 1 attribute, the height, for each person in the sample in this case. Whereas 2 variable statistics, I'm measuring 2 attributes for each item in the sample. So if I have that same sample of 10 people, I can measure their heights. I can also measure their shoe size. So now I'm measuring 2 variables for that for each person in that sample. And if I am measuring 2 variables for each person in that sample, I can now compare those 2 variables and create a scatter plot or a line graph to see the relationship between those variables. So let's fill in this chart. What kinds of graphs would we use for 1 variable statistics? Well, these would be things like bar graphs, pie charts, and histograms, like we saw in the previous lesson. Those are all useful for graphing 1 variable or 1 attribute for each item. And the type of analysis we can do with 1 variable stats are, well, the mean, the median, and the mode. If you're working with 2 variables, though, you're not going to have a bar graph. That doesn't make any sense. So what kind of graphs can we use for 2 variable stats? Well, these are things like scatter plots or line graphs. And analysis, well, you can't take the mean or the average of 2 different things. Like it doesn't really make much sense to do that. So we look more at relationships between 2 variables. We look at something called a correlation, or if you're drawing a scatter plot, you can make a line of best fit. So we're going to talk about all those things. Okay, so let's get to some practice. Example 1. Here I have a table of values. Dollars spent on lunch, number of days. Okay, so between $0 and $2 spent on lunch, that was for 6 days. For 4 days, $2 to $4 were spent. For 8 days, $4 to $6 were spent on lunch. For 3 days, $6 to $8 were spent on lunch. And for 2 days, $8 to $10 was spent on lunch. So the question I have first is this one or two variable data? Well, remember, one variable would be for each item in the sample. I'm measuring one attribute. And for two variable, I'd be measuring two attributes. So what is it here? It's kind of tricky because a lot of people say, well, there's two columns in the table, so this is two variables. But the number of days that this happens isn't a variable. This is just a frequency. Frequency is not a variable. Frequency just means the number of times something occurs. That's not an attribute that I'm measuring. The amount of money spent on lunch, I'm measuring that. So this is the only variable that's being measured, is the amount of money spent on lunch. So this is one variable data. So if we wanted to graph this data, we're not going to use a scatter plot. We're going to use something like a bar graph or a histogram or something like that, but you have to decide, is it a bar graph or is it a histogram? Well, if our variable is amount of money, and I'm given different intervals, these aren't separate categories. This is a continuous scale from $0 to $10 and anything in between. So I'm not dealing with separate categories. That means I'm not going to draw a bar graph to represent this data. I'm going to draw a histogram. And if you don't have a lot of practice making histograms, I'll show you how to make one now, and then hopefully it'll make more sense as you go. So I'm just going to show you a histogram and then talk about it. Okay, so my variable is the amount of money spent on lunch. So that's what I put on my x-axis, or my horizontal axis. And it's a continuous scale, so it goes from 0 to 10, everything in between. Now the intervals are evenly spaced, you'll notice, so I should have my intervals evenly spaced on the axis. The next thing is the number of days, or the frequency, is on my vertical axis, my y-axis. You want to make sure your scale is consistent, going up by the same amount, and they're evenly spaced along the axis. So for the interval between $0 to $2, there were 6 days where that amount of money was spent. So I draw my bar up to 6 days between $0 and $2. Between $2 and $4, there were 4 days where that amount was spent. So here's my other bar, etc. And you want to make sure that your bars are touching each other. These are not separate categories of information. They're on a continuous scale. So keep those things in mind as you create histograms. Okay, my second example deals with the same subject as example 1. So in example 1, we had the money spent on lunch and the number of days where each of those amounts were spent. So think of money spent on lunch as one variable, like we did in example 1. Think of a situation that would give a second variable to measure in a two-variable relationship. So if I'm measuring how much money is spent on lunch, and I want to know how that amount of money affects something else, what is the something else that I could measure? In other words, what is a relationship that I could determine between two things? And one of the things is the amount of money spent on lunch. I don't know if that made sense the way I said it. I'll give you an example. Maybe that'll illustrate what I'm trying to say. So for example, I could compare the amount of money spent on lunch with the amount of money earned at a job. So perhaps, and I haven't done a study to figure this out, but perhaps the more money people make at their job, the more they spend on lunch. So you might see a scatter plot that has a trend that looks something like this. where you see a positive relationship between the two. As one goes up, so does the other one. So try to think of another situation that you could compare amount of money spent on lunch with something else, and what would you expect the graph to look at? For the practice questions in this lesson, first I'd like you to read example 1 and example 2. It's from page 131 in the textbook that I'm using, but I have a link to it on the weekly checklist. So just read through those examples first, and then try the questions, which are also posted in the weekly checklist. So check out those questions, try them. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out for help.